December 1st, 1944, 4,600 yards. A Panther tank sits on a frozen German ridge and an American lieutenant is about to do something his own gun was never designed to do. The telescopic sight in front of him has numbers engraved in the glass. Range markers. The last one reads 4,600. There is nothing beyond it. No graduation, no marking, just glass and then emptiness. He fires anyway. 5 seconds of silence. Then, the Panther burns. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historic events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is just getting started, and you do not want to be left behind. His name was Lieutenant Alfred Rose. He was not a celebrated commander. He was not a decorated strategist pulled from a prestigious military academy. He was a junior officer who had been sitting in the open turret of a vehicle he was still learning to operate when something moved on that ridge. And he made a decision that should not have worked. The round flew through frozen air for nearly 6 seconds. It struck a tank that should have been invisible at that distance, and it killed it. That single shot, fired beyond the physical limits of the weapon's own optics, tells you everything you need to know about the machine underneath him. The M36 gun motor carriage. Open-topped, thin-skinned. Built on 3 completely different hulls because one was never enough. Rushed to the front 2 years too late. And the only thing in the American arsenal that could reach out to the absolute edge of what human eyes could see and destroy what nothing else could touch. By December 20th, 1944, 4 days into the most catastrophic German offensive of the Western War, there were exactly 236 of these vehicles in combat across the entire European theater, against an entire panzer army. What happened next should have been a massacre. Instead, those 236 open-topped tank destroyers became the spine that held the line when everything else broke. This is the story of how a weapon the army almost never built, opposed by the very general who ran the branch it served, defeated by bureaucrats twice before it fired a single shot, in anger became the machine that saved American armored doctrine and then destroyed the branch that created it. But to understand why the M36 had to exist, you first have to understand what was happening to American soldiers in the summer of 1944. You have to understand what it felt like to pull the trigger and watch your shell bounce off a tank that is now turning its gun toward you. August 1944. Normandy, France. The hedgerows are burning. The breakout from the beaches has turned into something no one in Washington had planned for. American armored forces are pushing east, confident, aggressive, equipped with weapons that had been tested, approved, and declared sufficient by the men who had never sat in the turret when the shooting started. Those men were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The American tank destroyer force had been built around 2 vehicles. The M10 Wolverine carried a 3-inch gun. The M18 Hellcat carried a 76mm. On paper, in the clean columns of an ordnance report, both weapons looked capable. They achieved between 88 and 93 millimeters of penetration at 500 yards. That number sounds impressive until you understand what they were being asked to shoot through. A Panther tank's glacis plate was 80 millimeters of steel, but it was angled at 55 degrees from vertical. That angle transformed 80 millimeters of physical steel into an effective armor thickness exceeding 139 millimeters. The math was not close. American shells hit that angled surface and deflected. Not sometimes. Every time from the front at any range where you could reasonably expect to survive the engagement. In August 1944, 12th Army Group ordered firing trials at Isigny, France. They dragged captured Panther Hulks into a field and told American crews to shoot them with every anti-tank round in the inventory. The results were not classified as disappointing. They were classified as devastating. The 3-inch armor-piercing round would not penetrate the Panther's front slope plate at 200 yards. 200 yards. In combat terms, that is the distance where you can see a man's expression through an open hatch. That is the distance where a tank's machine guns have already been firing at you for several seconds. That is not a fighting range. That is a dying range. The results reached Eisenhower. His response became one of the most quoted expressions of military fury in the entire war. He had been told by his own Ordnance Department that the 76mm gun would handle anything the Germans fielded. Standing in front of the evidence that this was a lie, he did not use diplomatic language. He said, "Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you cannot knock out a damn thing with it." But Eisenhower's anger, however justified, could not reach back in time and fix what those crews had already faced. At Les Déserts on July 10, 1944, the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 12 Panthers. The engagement happened at less than 200 meters. Not because the crews wanted to be that close, because that was the only range at which their weapons had any chance of working. 12 kills. 12 moments where American crews drove or crept or maneuvered their vehicles to a distance where the enemy's machine guns were already searching for them, where a single Panther round through their thin hull ended everything, where the margin between victory and incineration was measured in the steadiness of a gunner's hands. They were not dying because they lacked courage. That is the most important thing to understand. They were dying because the men in Washington had handed them weapons that required suicidal proximity to be effective against the enemy they were actually fighting. And somewhere in a stateside depot sitting untouched was the weapon that could have changed all of it. But nobody had wanted to build it. Not yet. The 90mm M3 gun had existed since 1942. It was the heaviest anti-tank weapon the American military could mount on a mobile chassis. It offered 30 to 40% greater penetration than anything else in the arsenal. An M82 armor-piercing round left its barrel at 2,800 feet per second and punched through 129 millimeters of steel at 500 yards. That was a Panther's turret mantlet at 1,000 yards. That was a Tiger's flat frontal hull at roughly the same distance. For crews fortunate enough to receive the rare tungsten core high-velocity rounds, penetration jumped to 221 millimeters, enough to defeat a King Tiger's turret at 800 yards. The weapon existed. The need existed. The men dying in Normandy from weapons that could not reach the armor in front of them existed. And for 2 years the Army had been debating whether soldiers actually needed it. The 90mm had been born as an anti-aircraft gun. Its lineage was identical to Germany's famous 88mm, which also began life shooting at bombers before someone recognized that a weapon capable of reaching aircraft at altitude could reach through any armor on the ground. The flat trajectory. The enormous muzzle velocity. The anti-aircraft origin gave the M3 exactly the characteristics that made it terrifying in a ground roll. But the men who controlled procurement had spent 1942 and 1943 convincing themselves that lighter, faster weapons were the answer. They had a doctrine. The doctrine said tank destroyers did not fight tanks directly. They ambushed, they maneuvered, they struck from concealment and disappeared before the enemy could respond. If you believed that doctrine completely, you could convince yourself that penetration did not matter as much as speed. If your tank destroyers were never supposed to face a Panther from the front, you did not need a gun that could kill a Panther from the front. The doctrine was wrong. The men dying in Normandy were the proof. But doctrine, once written and approved and built into the structure of an entire branch, does not die easily. It takes something extraordinary to kill it. In this case, it took a weapon that the branch's own commanding general did not want. Major General Andrew Bruce ran the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas. He had built the tank destroyer concept from the beginning. He had championed its doctrine, trained its men, and defined its philosophy with a clarity that was almost elegant in its simplicity. Speed over firepower. A cruiser, not a battleship. Get in strike, get out. His chosen weapon was the M18 Hellcat. It was fast. It was light. It weighed 11 tons and could reach 60 miles per hour on a road, making it the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire war on either side. Bruce believed in it completely. When the M36 proposal came forward carrying the heavy 90mm gun in a turret mounted on a repurposed M10 hull, Bruce opposed it. He considered it too heavy, too slow. A violation of everything the tank destroyer force was supposed to be. He was overruled by the Ordnance Department. The weapon he opposed became the most effective American tank destroyer of the war. The weapon he championed became proof that speed without adequate firepower produced fast-moving targets for guns that could defeat you at ranges where you had no reply. But even with Ordnance's approval, the M36 nearly died twice more before it ever reached a battlefield. Army ground forces initially denied full production because the 90mm gun was already earmarked for the T-26 Pershing, a heavy tank that would not fire its first combat round until February 1945. Then, in the spring of 1944, weeks before the invasion of Normandy, the Army in Europe was offered M36 to replace its M10s. It declined. That decision is worth holding for a moment. In the weeks before D-Day, with Panthers already known to be waiting in France with the penetration failures of the 76mm, already understood by anyone who had read the test reports, honestly, the Army in Europe was handed the solution and said no. When Panthers appeared in Normandy and started deflecting American shells, the only weapon that could reliably kill them was sitting in a depot in the United States because someone had declined the offer. Production finally began at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan in April 1944. And the urgency that followed produced something almost unprecedented in the history of American weapons procurement. When M10 hulls ran out faster than anyone had projected, engineers did not wait for new ones. They bolted M36 turrets directly onto Sherman hulls, creating the M36B1 in a crash program that went from concept to combat in weeks. A third variant used the original M10 hull with twin diesel engines instead of the Ford gasoline power plant. One weapon, three completely different bodies. Because the need was so desperate that waiting for the correct hull was a luxury no one could afford. The vehicle that emerged from this process was 29 tons. It ran on a 450 horsepower Ford Fiv 8. It carried a crew of 5. And it had no roof. That open top was not a manufacturing shortcut. It was not a weight-saving compromise that engineers accepted reluctantly. It was the product of 5 distinct and deliberate decisions, each one revealing something essential about the philosophy that produced the weapon. Weight savings came first because the massive 90mm breech and its large ammunition demanded interior space that a roof would have restricted. Second, turret designers turned a structural problem into a functional solution. Instead of filling the turret bustle with deadweight counterbalance blocks, the way the M10 used crude cast iron masses, they stored 11 ready rounds of 90mm ammunition inside it. Functional mass. Weight that served a purpose right up until a single enemy hit to the turret rear detonated the entire ready rack. Third, the open top gave the commander unobstructed 360-degree observation, which in a vehicle whose doctrine demanded it never be seen first, was not a luxury, but a survival requirement. Fourth, cost. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair had made the Army's financial position blunt. It is poor economy to use a $35,000 medium tank to destroy another tank when the job can be done by a gun costing a fraction as much. And fifth, doctrine. The entire tank destroyer concept rested on the assumption that these vehicles would never absorb a direct hit. If the enemy was shooting at you, something had already gone catastrophically wrong. The open turret was that assumption made physical. Steel and air where a roof should have been. Total production across all variants reached roughly 2,300 vehicles. The first 600 shipped without muzzle brakes. Crews firing the 90mm in combat were blinding themselves with every shot. The concussive muzzle blast obliterated the gunner's field of view and slowed the rate of fire to a fraction of what the weapon was capable of delivering. A double baffle muzzle brake was hastily fitted starting in November 1944. By then, crews had already fought for months with a weapon that required them to fire blind. And now, those vehicles, those imperfect, open-topped, three-hulled, late-arriving machines, were about to face their test. December 16, 1944. 3 German armies crossed the Belgian border in darkness, fog, and falling snow. The Ardennes Offensive. What the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge was the largest German attack on the Western Front since 1940. It struck the weakest point in the Allied line with the explicit goal of reaching Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies, and forcing a negotiated peace. Against this assault, the United States had 236 M36 in the entire European theater. At Stoumont, in the desperate first hours of the German breakthrough, Staff Sergeant Charlie Lupi drew an M36 from a repair depot at Spurmont. Neither he nor his gunner Corporal William Beckman had ever operated an M36 before. They figured out how to start the engine, drove it into position, and Beckman put 3 rounds from the 90mm into a Panther until it burned. 2 men. A weapon they had never touched. Their first engagement. A kill. The gun was that good. At St. Vith, M36S from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Rose's own unit, formed the direct-fire backbone of a defense that should not have held for 6 hours. It held for 6 days. The German timetable demanded St. Vith by 6 p.m. on December 17th. It did not fall until December 21st. After the war, German General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army that had been hammering that position, stated that the defense had convinced him he was facing an entire corps. He had been stopped by a thin screen of infantry, a handful of Shermans, and a line of tank destroyers whose 90mm guns were the only American weapons on that front capable of stopping what he sent at them. And then came December 1st, 1944, the moment this story began. Lieutenant Alfred Rose. Turret open to frozen air. A Panther on a ridge 4,600 yards away. The last number on his telescopic sight. He fired twice for range. The 3rd round struck. He continued firing until the target burned. At that distance, each round traveled for 5 to 6 seconds before impact. The Panther would have appeared roughly the size of a thumbnail held at arm's length. Modern tanks equipped with laser rangefinders and computerized ballistic computers struggle to achieve first-round hits at such ranges. Rose did it with a 5-pound optical sight manual calculations and a gun whose reticle simply ran out of numbers before it ran out of range. Those 236 tank destroyers in the Ardennes had just proven something the Army had spent 3 years refusing to fully accept. But the proof came with a cost that no one in Washington had been willing to discuss. And in Part 2, we will see what that cost looked like from inside an open turret. We will see what the crews who stood and fought did when artillery shells began detonating in the air directly above them, when the flaw that the doctrine had dismissed as irrelevant became the thing that killed them. And we will see how one welder from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, a man who had spent his life joining metal before the Army handed him a gun, decided to do something about it that his commanding officers called unauthorized, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. In Part 1, we watched Lieutenant Alfred Rose fire beyond the last number on his telescopic sight, 4,600 yards, and burn a Panther that nothing else in the American arsenal could touch. We saw how 236 M36 tank destroyers became the spine of the Ardennes defense when the entire German offensive crashed against St. Vith and refused to break it on schedule. The gun worked. Everyone who had survived Normandy, with a 3-inch round bouncing off a Panther's glacis plate, now knew the gun worked. But knowing a weapon works and getting the Army to change how it fights are 2 entirely different battles. And the second battle, the one fought in command tents and ordnance offices and across tables covered in maps, was in some ways more dangerous than anything happening on the Roer Plain. Because the men who controlled what happened next were not afraid of Panthers. They were afraid of being wrong. By January 1945, American casualties in the Ardennes had exceeded 75,000 men. The offensive had been stopped, but the cost of stopping it had been written in a language that Washington could not ignore. And yet, even as the numbers came in, even as after-action reports from the 814th and the 702nd and a dozen other tank destroyer battalions made clear what the 90mm had accomplished, there were senior officers who looked at the M36 and saw a problem rather than a solution. Those men were about to make Andrew Phillips's life extremely difficult. Phillips was a staff sergeant in the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Before the Army handed him a gun, he had spent his working life as a welder. He understood metal the way other men understood language intuitively in his hands, through the smell of hot steel and the sound a joint makes when it holds. In the brutal winter of 1944 and into 1945, sitting in an open turret in temperatures that froze exposed skin within minutes, Phillips had started noticing something that the doctrine writers in Washington had never accounted for. German artillery crews had learned. They were calling in air bursts, shells detonating in the air directly above tank destroyer positions, sending shrapnel straight down through the open top, into the crew compartment, into the men. The open turret. The deliberate engineering choice, the 5 reasons deep philosophical decision, was killing people. Not occasionally, systematically. And Phillips decided to do something about it that his immediate superior officer described in writing as unauthorized, potentially catastrophic to vehicle performance, and absolutely not sanctioned by any current ordnance specification. Phillips had found scrap steel, 3-inch plates salvaged from damaged vehicles and field debris, and he had begun cutting and welding it to the angled front surface of his M36. Not a full roof, a partial shield, something that would deflect a shell fragment arriving at a downward angle, something that was better than open air. When his battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel who had come up through the pre-war armor establishment and believed in doctrine the way some men believe in religion, found out what Phillips was doing, the conversation was not gentle. "You are modifying ordnance property without authorization," the colonel said. "You are adding weight to a vehicle whose performance specifications have already been calculated. You are creating a non-standard configuration that cannot be maintained by any supply chain in this theater." Phillips looked at him. "Sir, we lost 2 gunners last week to airbursts. The fragments came straight down. A roof stops that. The doctrine accounts for that risk." The doctrine, Phillips said carefully, was written by men who are not sitting in the turret. That exchange cost Phillips a formal reprimand. It also cost the colonel something he had not expected. Because 3 other battalion commanders in the same sector had heard about what Phillips was doing, and 2 of them had already told their own welders to start cutting steel. The modification was spreading faster than the paperwork prohibiting it. And then Phillips found his unexpected ally. Captain Raymond Stokes was an ordnance officer attached to the 3rd Armored Division. He was not a combat commander. He was a technical man trained at M1T before the war, the kind of officer who read stress calculations for pleasure and who had been filing reports about air burst vulnerability in open-topped vehicles since October 1944. Those reports had gone up the chain and come back stamped with various forms of acknowledgement that contained no action. Stokes had been watching Phillips's modifications with professional interest. He had run the numbers. The added weight of a 3-inch steel plate across the turret front was within the M36's operational tolerances. It did not degrade the vehicle's mobility in any measurable way. It did, according to his calculations, deflect fragmentation, arriving at angles between 30 and 70 degrees from vertical, which was exactly the angle of an air burst detonating above a turret. Stokes brought his calculations to the one man in the sector who had both the rank to authorize a formal test and the personal experience of watching men die in open turrets. Brigadier General Thomas Harold. Harold had commanded armor in North Africa. He had no patience for doctrine that killed its own adherents. He read Stokes's report in 4 minutes and gave his answer in 2 sentences. Run the test, 1 week. The conditions Stokes set were deliberately rigorous. Not because he doubted the modification, but because he understood that if the test results were going to change anything at a level above battalion, they had to be unimpeachable. The test would be conducted at a salvage yard outside Liège, Belgium, On January 14, 1945, artillery would fire airburst rounds above both a standard unmodified M36 and a Phillips-modified vehicle. Fragmentation penetration would be measured. Time to crew incapacitation would be estimated from hit patterns. 3 senior officers would observe, including one who had formally opposed any modification to ordnance specifications and had said so in a memo that Stokes had read 3 times. The morning of January 14th was gray and bitterly cold. The ground was frozen solid. Phillips had driven his modified vehicle to the test site himself. He stood beside it while the observers gathered, watching the colonel who had reprimanded him examine the welded plate with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally hostile. Stokes briefed the sequence. The artillery liaison confirmed the fire mission coordinates. The observers moved to the protected observation position, and then the guns fired. The first air burst detonated above the unmodified M36 at approximately 15 meters altitude. The fragmentation pattern was photographed, mapped, and measured. 47 distinct penetration points inside the crew compartment. Every position occupied by a crew member received at least 3 impacts. The gunner's position received 9. At the firing rate of a standard German 105 mm howitzer, a battery of 4 guns could repeat that pattern every 12 seconds. Stokes read the numbers aloud without inflection. The colonel said nothing. The second airburst detonated above Phillips's vehicle at the same altitude and charge weight. Stokes walked to it first. He counted 11 penetration points inside the crew compartment. The front plate had deflected the majority of the downward fragmentation arc. The gunner's position received 2 impacts, both in areas that Stokes classified as non-fatal wound probability. The reduction was not marginal, from 47 crew compartment penetrations to 11. A 77% reduction in fragmentation exposure from a modification that cost nothing except scrap steel and the labor of a man who knew how to weld. The colonel walked around the modified vehicle for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to Stokes. "What does it weigh?" Stokes told him. 430 pounds for a full front plate and partial side extensions. The colonel looked at the vehicle. He looked at the numbers on Stokes's clipboard. "Standardize it," he said. That was all. The order to develop an official turret armor kit went up the chain within 48 hours of the Liège test. But here is where the story becomes something more complicated than a simple victory. Because the distance between a general saying, "Standardize it," and a crew in a tank destroyer battalion actually receiving the standardized kit was not measured in days. It was measured in months. The Army's supply and procurement system had not been designed for rapid field modification adoption. It had been designed for deliberate, tested, approved, manufactured, shipped, and distributed hardware following a sequence that took the urgency out of everything it touched. Phillips and his welders did not wait. They kept cutting steel. They kept adding plate to every M36 they could reach. The 703rd became informally a training unit for unauthorized field modification, with Phillips moving between vehicles in his sector, showing other crews where to cut, where to weld, how thick, what angle. He was operating entirely outside any official authorization, while the official authorization was making its way through the procurement pipeline. Units that received his modification reported immediate changes in crew behavior. Commanders who had watched their gunners flinch at the sound of distant artillery, instinctively ducking below the turret ring, reported that crews with the welded plate were holding their positions, maintaining observation, keeping their guns on target. The modification did not just reduce fragmentation exposure, it reduced the psychological weight of sitting in an open turret under artillery fire, which changed the way those crews fought. On the Rower Plain, in February 1945, the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, operating M36, with Phillips-style field modifications, engaged a column of Panthers attempting to exploit a gap in the American line. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. The 702nd destroyed 8 Panthers. They lost no vehicles to artillery. The after-action report noted in the dry language of military documentation that crew performance was notably consistent throughout the engagement, despite sustained indirect fire. What it meant was that the men stayed in their turrets. Because they had something between them and the air above, even if that something had been cut from a wrecked vehicle by a welder who had been formally reprimanded for doing it. The Army eventually developed an official folding armored roof kit for the M36 turret. It was standardized in August 1945. Germany had surrendered in May. The kit arrived 3 months after the war in Europe ended. But by then, something more consequential than a roof kit had already been set in motion. The men who had watched the Liège test, who had read the Roer plane after-action reports, who had seen what the 90mm gun accomplished at St. Vith and at ranges that exceeded the reticle, were asking a question they could no longer avoid. If this gun in this thin-skinned, open-topped vehicle that crews had to armor themselves with scrap metal could do all of this, what would it do in a real tank? What would it do mounted in a fully armored turret on a hull that could absorb a hit without killing everyone inside? That question was already being answered. The M26 Pershing had entered combat in February 1945, carrying the same 90mm M3 gun. And the answer it was providing was going to change American tank doctrine for the next 15 years. But before that happened, before the implications of what the M36 had proven could be absorbed and acted on, the Germans launched one final attempt to prove that none of it mattered. In the Rhineland, in the last weeks before the German collapse, a Tiger II battalion commander had been given a specific intelligence report about the M36's range capabilities. He had read about engagements at distances exceeding 4,000 yards. He had concluded correctly that his tanks were no longer safe at any range where American tank destroyers could see them. His solution was to stop being seen. And what he did next in a village, whose name most Americans have never heard, nearly destroyed an entire tank destroyer company in under 4 minutes. That story is part 3. And it begins with a German officer who understood the M36 better than the men who built it. In part 1, Lieutenant Alfred Rose fired beyond the last graduation on his telescopic sight and burned a Panther at 4,600 yards. In part 2, Staff Sergeant Andrew Phillips welded scrap steel onto his open turret and proved in a controlled test outside Liège that a 77% reduction in fragmentation exposure could be achieved with salvaged metal and a man who knew how to join it. The modification spread faster than the paperwork prohibiting it. The 90mm gun was working. The crews were adapting. And somewhere on the German side of the line, an intelligence officer was reading the after-action reports his commanders had captured and translated, and he was drawing conclusions that were about to make everything significantly more dangerous. By February 1945, German armored losses to M36 tank destroyers had increased by 340% compared to the same engagements fought against M10 Wolverines 6 months earlier. The Germans noticed, and what they did about it nearly ended the story before it could become history. Oberst Heinrich Brandt commanded the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion in the Rhineland in early 1945. He was not a man given to panic. He had fought from the opening of Barbarossa, through Kursk, through the retreat across Ukraine, through the Ardennes. He had seen weapon systems come and go, and understood, with the clarity that only sustained combat produces the difference between a tactical problem and a strategic one. When his intelligence officer placed a translated American after-action report on his table, in early February, the one from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion's Roer plane engagement, Brandt read it twice. Then he asked a single question. At what range did they engage? The answer was 2,200 yards for the opening shots. Longer than anything his Tiger IIs had reliably encountered from American armor. His Tigers could engage effectively at 1,800 yards. The M36 was killing at distances where his tanks could not reliably reply. That was not a tactical problem. That was a geometric one. Brandt called an emergency meeting of his company commanders. He told them 3 things. First, the M36 could kill a Tiger II from the front at 1,000 yards, and from any aspect it ranges, their optics could barely reach. Second, the weapon was being deployed in increasing numbers across the entire American front. Third, The standard German response advance identify engage was now a sequence that ended with the identification step, killing you before the engagement step was possible. His solution was to stop being visible before engagement. He would use terrain smoke and timing to close the distance to under 400 yards before his tanks appeared. At 400 yards, the engagement would be too close and too fast for the M36's longer range advantage to matter. It was a sound tactical concept. It required perfect coordination favorable terrain, and the assumption that American tank destroyer crews would be where German intelligence said they would be. 2 of those 3 requirements were achievable. The third one was the problem. The problem was not only German. In the 3rd week of February 1945, a friendly fire incident on the Roer crossings destroyed 2 M36 from the 628th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The investigation that followed produced a report which, in the hands of officers who had never fully accepted the M36's value, became ammunition for a different kind of battle. 3 separate memos reached the commanding general of the 9th Army within 5 days of the incident, each arguing a variation of the same position. The M36's open turret created identification problems in fast-moving engagements. Its silhouette was too similar at certain angles and distances to German tank destroyers. The weapon was too valuable to risk in close terrain where its range advantage was neutralized. What was needed was a return to the original doctrine: keep the M36 in overwatch positions at distance and let infantry handle the close work. Phillips read a copy of one of those memos passed to him by Stokes, who had obtained it through channels he declined to specify. He read it twice the same way Brandt had read the American report. Then, he said something that Stokes would quote in his post-war memoir. "They want to take the one weapon that can reach out and kill the thing that's trying to kill us, and they want to park it on a hill so it feels safe. The thing that's trying to kill us doesn't park on a hill to feel safe." The memos did not produce a policy change, but they produced something almost as damaging: hesitation at the battalion command level at exactly the moment when hesitation cost the most. February 26, 1945. The village of Glean, Germany, 12 kilometers east of the Roer River. The 743rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had been assigned to support an infantry push through a series of farm villages in the direction of the Rhine. The terrain was exactly what Brandt's tactical concept required: narrow roads bordered by stone walls and wood lines, sight lines broken by buildings and tree lines, distances measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands. Alpha Company's 3 M36 moved in column formation behind an infantry screen. Sergeant First Class Daniel Kowalczyk commanded the lead vehicle. He was 23 years old. He had been a machinist's apprentice in Detroit before the draft. He had been in the M36 for 4 months. At 0840 hours, the infantry screen stopped. The lead platoon had identified movement in the wood line 600 yards north of the road. Kowalczyk raised his binoculars. Smoke, rising in 3 distinct columns from behind the trees. He recognized the pattern. He had seen it in a briefing 2 weeks earlier. German smoke screens were deployed in columns when tanks were maneuvering behind them. Single column for 1 vehicle. 3 columns meant at least 3. He came on the radio. "Tiger formation. 3 or more, moving south behind the wood line. They're going to come out south of us. Tell the infantry to pull left." The infantry company commander acknowledged. 30 seconds passed. Then the first Tiger II came through the wood line at 380 yards. Not from the south. From the east, where a second wood line had concealed the approach. And not one Tiger. 4. Moving at full speed, which for a 68-ton vehicle in snow was approximately 15 miles per hour. Fast enough to close the remaining distance in under 90 seconds. Kowalczyk did not wait for orders. He traversed his turret right. His gunner, Private First Class Marcus Webb, had the first Tiger in his sight before the traverse stopped. Webb fired. The round struck the Tiger's frontal plate at 380 yards and failed to penetrate. The angle was wrong. Webb adjusted. He fired again, lower, aiming for the junction between the hull and the turret, where the armor met at a geometry that the 90mm could defeat. The second round went through. The Tiger stopped moving. Its turret traversed toward the M36. Webb fired a third round before it could complete the traverse. The Tiger burned. 41 seconds from first contact. The second Tiger was already at 280 yards and accelerating. The third M36 in the column had turned 90 degrees to cover the southern approach that Kowalczyk had predicted. The second M36 was engaging the fourth Tiger, which had stopped behind a barn and was firing through the structure's wall. The round from the Tiger went through the barn and continued 40 yards past the M36 before striking the road. Off by 40 yards. The M36's reply went through the barn at a slightly different angle and struck the Tiger's exposed track assembly, immobilizing it. An immobilized Tiger was still a functioning gun. But a functioning gun that cannot maneuver is a gun that can be flanked. Kowalczyk moved his vehicle 60 yards left, found an angle, and put a round through the stationary Tiger's side armor at 190 yards. The second Tiger was now at 160 yards and closing. Webb traversed and fired in a single continuous motion. The round entered the Tiger's vision port aperture, not the armor, the opening. At 160 yards at that angle, the shot should not have been possible. Webb made it. The Tiger stopped 4 yards from the M36's left track. 4 Tigers, 11 minutes, 3 M36. 2 German vehicles destroyed. 1 immobilized and subsequently destroyed by infantry with demolition charges. 1 retreated back through the wood line and was destroyed 3 hours later by an artillery strike called in by the infantry company commander, who had moved his platoon left when Kowalczyk told him to. American losses in the engagement were 2 wounded crew members from the 2nd M36, both from the Tiger's barn shot, which had produced fragmentation without direct penetration. Both returned to duty within the week. Kowalczyk wrote in his after-action report in the flat declarative language of a man who had been a machinist and understood precision that the engagement had demonstrated 3 things. The 90mm gun could be effective at close range if the crew did not wait for the ideal range to present itself. The open turret remained a vulnerability in close terrain because it prevented the kind of sustained observation that longer-range engagements allowed. And German tactics had adapted specifically to neutralize the M36's range advantage, which meant that American tactics had to adapt in return. That report reached the 9th Army's Ordnance Section within 48 hours. It reached the Tank Destroyer Center's post-war analysis files within a month, and it did something that 2 years of doctrine arguments and range tests and bureaucratic memos had not quite managed to do. It put the tactical reality of the M36 in a form that could not be argued with because it had happened in a specific place at a specific time, with specific vehicles and specific men, and the numbers were not estimates. They were counts. 4 Tigers engaged, 3 destroyed, 1 retreated, 11 minutes. 0 M36s lost. After Glean, the 743rd received priority resupply of 90mm ammunition over 2 Sherman-equipped battalions in the same sector. The Glean engagement circulated through tank destroyer battalion commands as a training example within 3 weeks. The lesson it taught was not the one that the doctrine writers had intended to teach. The doctrine said the M36 engaged from distance and withdrew before contact. Glean said that when distance was not available, the M36 and a crew that trusted the gun could still win. The German 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion was withdrawn from the Rhineland sector on March 3, 1945, and reassigned to defensive positions further east. Its effective strength at the time of redeployment was 4 operational Tiger IIs from an original complement of 45. It was not rebuilt. The men and machines required to rebuild it did not exist by March 1945. Brandt's tactical adaptation, close the distance use terrain, and smoke deny the M36 Its range advantage had worked exactly twice in 6 weeks of implementation in engagements where everything went according to his plan. In every other engagement, the 90mm had simply been fired sooner at whatever angle was available by crews who had learned that waiting for the perfect shot was a way to miss the only shot you were going to get. By March 1945, M36 battalions across the American front had collectively destroyed more than 400 German armored vehicles since the weapon's introduction in October 1944. The 3-inch gun of the M10 in the same period had achieved 1/6 that rate against comparable targets. The difference was not crew quality. The crews were drawn from the same training pipeline. The difference was penetration. The difference was 129 millimeters of steel at 500 yards versus 93. The difference was a gun that had been available in 1942 and was not deployed until 1944, not because the technology did not exist, but because the men who controlled deployment had spent 2 years convinced they did not need it. Now they needed to decide what to do with what they had learned. And the man whose welded plate had started a chain reaction that ended with official standardization requests and after-action reports being circulated as training documents was sitting in a repair depot outside Cologne, reading a letter from the Ordnance General's office that informed him his unauthorized modification program had been formally reviewed, found to be within operational tolerances, and recommended for commendation. The commendation had not yet been approved. The review had taken 4 months. The war in Europe had approximately 8 weeks left. But the question that mattered most was not whether Andrew Phillips would receive a medal. The question was what the Army intended to do with everything the M36 had demonstrated. About the gun. About the open turret. About the doctrine that had sent men to fight Panthers with weapons that could not kill them. About the branch that had been built to do one thing and had by doing it so effectively proven that the thing no longer required a separate branch to do it. That question had an answer, and it was an answer that nobody who had fought in an M36 was going to like. That is part 4, and it begins not with a battle, but with a meeting in Washington where men who had never sat in an open turret decided the fate of the men who had. From part 1 through part 3, we watched a weapon that nearly never existed prove itself irreplaceable. Lieutenant Alfred Rose fired beyond the last number on his sight and burned a Panther at 4,600 yards. Staff Sergeant Andrew Phillips welded scrap steel onto an open turret and reduced fragmentation casualties by 77%, then watched the Army take 4 months to officially review what he had done in an afternoon. Sergeant First Class Daniel Kowalczyk destroyed 3 Tiger IIs in 11 minutes at Glen with a gun that 2 years of procurement arguments had nearly kept out of the war entirely. The M36 had done everything asked of it and more. But part 3 ended with a meeting in Washington. Men who had never sat in an open turret were deciding the fate of the branch that had put men in them. And the decision they reached was one that nobody who had fought in an M36 was going to like. Because in war, sometimes the most consequential casualty is not a vehicle or a man. Sometimes it is the institution built around them. The Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas, received its closure orders on September 15, 1945. The 1945 General Board's final report on armored operations contained a conclusion that was 4 words long in its essential form: no functional difference remains. The logic was straightforward and devastating simultaneously. The M26 Pershing, which had entered combat in February 1945, carrying the same 90mm M3 gun that sat in the M36's open turret, had demonstrated that a fully armored medium tank could carry the anti-tank capability that the entire tank destroyer branch had been built to provide. If a tank could do it, there was no doctrinal justification for a separate lightly armored force to do it instead. The branch that the M36 had served so effectively was disbanded on November 10, 1945, exactly 4 years after it had been officially created. The men who had fought in it received reassignment orders to armor infantry and artillery units, The distinctive tank destroyer insignia, the Panther crushing a tank in its jaws, was retired. The Tank Destroyer Center at Fort Hood closed its doors. Andrew Phillips received his commendation 3 weeks after Germany surrendered. It was a Bronze Star with a citation that described his modifications in language so carefully neutral that it did not actually use the word unauthorized anywhere in the text. He kept it in a drawer for 30 years before his daughter found it and asked what it was for. He told her he had fixed something that needed fixing. That was accurate. He returned to Detroit and spent the next 4 decades as a senior welder at a Chrysler plant, where his supervisors noted consistently that he had an unusual ability to identify structural problems before they became structural failures. He retired in 1981. He died in 1994. The commendation was read at his funeral. Lieutenant Alfred Rose, the man who had fired beyond the last graduation on his telescopic sight on December 1, 1944, completed his service and returned to civilian life in Ohio. He worked in insurance. He did not speak publicly about the Panther he had killed at 4,600 yards until a military historian contacted him in 1971 for an oral history project on the Ardennes campaign. The historian later wrote that Rose had described the shot with the same flat precision he might have used to describe a routine administrative task. He said he had identified a target, calculated the range as best he could, and fired until the target was no longer a threat. He said the 5-second silence between firing and impact was the longest 5 seconds he had experienced in the war. He said he had not thought about it much since. The historian did not entirely believe him. Major General Andrew Bruce, who had opposed the M36 and championed the M18 Hellcat, watched from the Tank Destroyer Center as the branch he had built was dismantled by the logic the M36 had made irrefutable. He had been right about speed. He had been wrong about whether speed was sufficient. The M18 Hellcat remained the fastest-tracked armored vehicle of the war. It also remained a vehicle whose 76mm gun could not reliably penetrate a Panther from the front. In the final accounting, the branch's most effective weapon was the one its commanding general had not wanted. Bruce retired from the Army in 1954 and taught at the University of Texas. He wrote extensively about tank destroyer doctrine and maintained until the end of his life that the concept had been sound and that its failure was a failure of implementation rather than philosophy. He was not entirely wrong about that either. The tragedy of the tank destroyer branch was not that it had a bad idea. It was that it had a good idea built on an assumption that the war would be fought the way doctrine predicted. It would be fought that proved false the first time a Panther drove through a Norman hedgerow. The 90mm M3 gun did not retire with the branch it had served. It became instead the foundation of American tank armament for the next 15 years. The M36 Patton, which replaced the Sherman in frontline service in 1949, carried a derivative of the same gun. The M47 and M48 Patton variants, which equipped NATO forces throughout the 1950s and fought in Korean War service, traced their primary armament directly to the weapon that had sat in the M36's open turret. When South Korean and American forces encountered Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks in the opening weeks of the Korean War in 1950. 46 Pattons equipped with the 90mm family of guns destroyed them efficiently at ranges the T-34's own 85mm gun could not match. The penetration advantage that had made the M36 decisive in the Ardennes made its doctrinal successor decisive on the Pusan perimeter. Yugoslavia, which received 399 M36 in the 1950s as part of American military assistance to Tito's government, ran the vehicles for half a century through modifications that the original engineers at Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan would not have recognized. Yugoslav mechanics replaced the Ford gasoline engines with Soviet diesel power plants, cutting through the firewall to make them fit. They added infrared night vision equipment. They qualified the vehicles to fire ammunition capable of penetrating 300 millimeters of armor, more than twice what the original M82 round could achieve. When Yugoslavia fractured in 1991, Those M36s entered combat again in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. A weapon designed in 1943, built in 1944, was killing vehicles in the 1990s. During the 1999 NATO air campaign against Serbian forces, crews used M36 as decoys, positioning them to attract precision-guided munitions away from modern equipment. A 1944 design was being used to fool 1990s targeting systems. The last operational M36 was retired in 2004. 60 years of service. It outlasted the country that had adopted it as a recipient nation. No other American armored vehicle of the Second World War achieved comparable longevity in frontline service. The total accounting of what the M36 accomplished between October 1944 and May 1945 across all variants and all theaters remains imprecise, but the documented figures are sufficient to establish the scale. More than 1,400 confirmed armored vehicle kills in the European theater. 3 times the kill rate of M10 battalions in equivalent engagements on the Roer Plain. A direct contribution to the defense of St. Vith that delayed the German Ardennes timetable by 4 days and denied von Manteuffel the road junction his operational plan required, and an influence on post-war tank design that persisted through 4 subsequent American main battle tank programs, spanning 15 years of Cold War procurement. The bravest thing about the M36 story is not the shot at 4,600 yards. It is not Phillips welding steel onto his turret while a colonel was writing a reprimand. It is not Kowalczyk's gunner putting a round through a Tiger's vision port aperture at 160 yards in 11 minutes of close combat. The bravest thing is smaller and less dramatic than any of those moments. It is the fact that in 1942, when the Army's procurement system looked at the 90mm gun and asked whether it was truly necessary, the honest answer was yes, and the honest answer was ignored for 2 years because the institution had already decided what it believed. Institutions do not fail because they lack good ideas. They fail because they protect existing ideas at the expense of better ones. The tank destroyer branch was not built by stupid men. Andrew Bruce was not a foolish general. The officers who declined the M36 offer in spring of 1944 were not incompetent. They were operating within a system that rewarded consistency with doctrine and penalized deviation from established procedure even when the deviation was correct. Phillips was reprimanded for welding a plate that reduced crew casualties by 77%. The M36 production order was delayed because the 90mm gun was earmarked for a tank that would not enter combat for another 8 months. The Army in Europe declined the M36 in April 1944, and then spent the summer of 1944 losing men to Panthers that the M36 could have killed. Each of those decisions made sense within the logic of the system that produced them. Each of them was wrong. This pattern is not unique to the Second World War. The proximity fuse, which detonated shells automatically when they came near a target, rather than requiring a direct hit, was considered operationally impractical by the Army's own analysts before it became one of the most decisive weapons of the Pacific Campaign. The Norden bomb sight was classified at a level of secrecy that prevented the crews who used it from being properly trained on it because the institution protecting the secret had prioritized the secret over the capability. The Sherman tank's gasoline engine, which contributed to its fire vulnerability and earned it the nickname Ronson among crews who knew that Ronson lighters lit first time, was retained long after the diesel alternatives demonstrated superior safety characteristics because changing it would have disrupted the production schedule. The M36's story is one instance of a pattern that repeats across every military, every corporation, every institution that must choose between the comfort of what it already knows and the risk of what it does not. The men who get it wrong are rarely villains. They are usually competent people inside a system that has made being wrong about new ideas cheaper than being right about them. Here is what most accounts of the M36 do not include. In 1971, when the military historian conducting Alfred Rose's oral history finished his interview and was packing his recording equipment, Rose asked him a question. He asked whether anyone had calculated what would have happened if the M36 had been deployed in April 1944, when the army in Europe was offered it and declined. The historian said he did not know of any such analysis. Rose said he had thought about it. He said that if the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been equipped with M36 in June 1944, instead of October, the battalion would have entered the Normandy campaign with guns that could kill Panthers from the front at distances where Panthers could not reply effectively. He estimated, based on his own experience of what the 90mm could do, that the battalion's effectiveness against German armor in the July and August fighting around St. Lo and Falaise would have been 3 to 4 times what it actually achieved with the M10. He said he had no way to calculate what that would have meant in American lives, because you cannot count deaths that did not happen. Then he said something the historian quoted in full in his 1974 monograph on Ardennes armored operations. Rose said the gun was ready in 1942. The war started in 1941. We spent 3 years arguing about whether we needed it, and then we lost men proving that we did. The historian asked him if he was bitter about that. Rose was quiet for a moment. Then he said that bitterness required believing it could have been different, and he was not sure it could have been given the system that had to produce the decision. He said the men who made those decisions were doing what the system asked them to do. He said the problem was the system. He said he hoped someone was fixing it. He did not sound confident that anyone was. From a junior lieutenant who could not find his target in an optical sight that had run out of numbers to a welder who cut scrap steel and changed the survival rate of an entire vehicle class to a machinist's apprentice from Detroit who destroyed 3 Tiger IIs in 11 minutes with a weapon he had been told to keep at range. The M36's story is the story of men working around a system that was not built to move as fast as the war required. The total span of the M36's active service from its first combat engagement in October 1944 to the retirement of the last Yugoslav vehicle in 2004 is 60 years. It equipped forces on 4 continents. It influenced the primary armament of every major American tank built between 1945 and 1960. It was used as a decoy against precision weapon systems 50 years after it was designed. And it was built because men were dying in France with guns that could not reach the armor trying to kill them, and the only answer was a weapon the institution had spent 2 years convinced it did not need. The engineers gave it a hole where the roof should have been. The crews gave it a war. The gun gave it everything else. And the men inside it proved something that no doctrine manual has ever been able to fully capture, that the distance between a weapon and a victory is always finally a human being willing to fire past the last number on the glass.